which is an initiative by the Australian government, specifically through the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and the Sayogyo Institute. If anyone, I don't think anyone has not heard of the Sayogyo Institute. It was founded by the late Professor Sayogyo, giant in the research, socioeconomic research, rural development, agrarian research. So I'm very honored to chair this session and also wish everyone at the Sayogyo Institute long live the institute to continue the legacy of Professor Sayogyo. We have 4 papers this afternoon, and let's go according to the list on the conference agenda. So the first paper is by Dr. Anna Valentina from the Australian National University and Budi Reso Sudarmo, also of the ANU, entitled Targeted Social Assistance Programs and Local Economies, the Case of Conditional Cash Transfer in Indonesia. So Ibu Anna, please go ahead to start your presentation, and as usual, the maximum time is 20 minutes.
Okay, Mbak Lydia. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to my session. Okay. I'm going to share with you. Can you see my screen clearly?
Yes, we can see it clearly.
Very good.
Yeah.
This is a joint paper with my professor, Professor Budi, on targeted social assistance program and local economies, the case of conditional cash transfer in Indonesia. Here's the overview of today's presentation. I'm going through the introduction, framework, and data identification strategy, empirical model, results, and conclusion. Oh, okay. I have 20 minutes. Okay. So the topic on PKH, I think it's quite popular in this conference. Targeted social assistance programs have been carried out to alleviate poverty in many developing countries. The programs have become popular globally and are being expanded following experiments and pilot projects in the early 2000s. Research showed that the programs provide additional income to particularly targeted groups in the society, for example, to the poor. A number of studies also indicate that targeted social assistance programs reduce poverty, improve health and education access. But the remaining question is, will the recipient ever graduate, or have these programs induced a domino effect on other things, for example, on improving liquidity and trade at the local economy? Cash transfer received from the programs relax the budgetary constraints on the poor, thereby increasing consumption and demand for goods and services. Conditionality on health and education encourages the poor to invest more on health and education, leading to the accumulation of capital accumulation, which eventually improves productivity. Understanding the local economy-wide impact of targeted social assistance programs is important, as it will provide evidence-based analysis to policymakers who are usually budget constrained into the side effects of the substantial investment in such program. If that investment can also expand local economy, the implication would be substantial because the poor rely on local economy for their livelihoods. Only a handful of studies have addressed the question of whether targeted social assistance programs stimulate the development of local economies. There are also several studies relating targeted social assistance program on other aspects in the society. For examples, on studies on targeted social assistance programs, some shows increasing utilization of health and education services. Other study also shows that the program decreased suicides. Another study shows a decrease or increased deforestation. The objectives of these studies are To estimate the dynamic effect of targeted social assistance program on the development of local economies. Second is to evaluate the effect heterogeneity, and lastly, to examine an underlying channel. In this study, we examine a major household assistance program known as Conditional Cash Transfer or CCT. In Bahasa, we call it a Program Keluarga Harapan or PKH. As one of the targeted social assistance program in Indonesia. We focus on micro and small enterprises as a proxy for local economies.
So just to let you know that the slide is not moving. I think it's still on the first page. If that's intentional, that's fine.
No.
Okay.
Now I'm on page. Okay, let me see.
Now it's
I think because
at my screen. Oh, it's the first page.
6. Now I'm on page 6.
No, it's not moving.
Oh.
So maybe reshare, Mbak Ana. Just stop share
Okay,
and then share again, maybe.
And share again. Okay. Okay, can you
All
see
right,
it now?
now it's yep. Now it's on the page of conditional cash transfer PKH.
Okay, sorry, bad internet connection here. So I'm going to explain a bit context on the PKH. The PKH targets poor households with pregnant or lactating women, school-age kids, conditional on meeting some requirements. The program provides quarterly transfer to beneficiaries as much as 6,000 to 2.2 million for per year for up to 6 years. This program was introduced to 6,000 households in 2007 in 6 provinces, and by 2013 it covered 2.3 million households in more than 3,400 sub-districts, covered 336 districts in all of Indonesia's provinces. The government spent an average of 8.5% of annual national public expenditure on PKH. And PKH is considered to be one of the most effective social assistance programs in Indonesia. It increased the utilization of health education services and increased antenatal care coverage for women. Okay. Sorry. Okay. I'm going to explain a bit on how the PKH has been implemented. The government, in general, the government used dual targeting system. First, they targeted the regions where the central government decided the province and district level quotas of PKH recipients. Then the provincial and district governments selected sub-districts based on an index that reflected supply side readiness in terms of education providers and healthcare services. The second level is targeting the household. Here, the government extracted a list of eligible households within these supply side ready sub-districts utilizing a unified database combined with a proxy mean test method. The local office of Social Affairs Ministry validated and updated the basic information and registered on eligible household. Next, the eligible household will receive their first payment, and during the year, local coordinators verified the compliance of beneficiaries within with the condition, and the beneficiary received a second then subsequent payment. So next, I'm going to explain the reason why we choose MSEs. So MSE stands for Micro and Small Enterprises, or we know as UMKM. There are 26 million of MSEs in various sectors with 53 million workers in 2006. MSEs shows relatively low productivity, reflecting low living standard of those engaged in production process. However, MSEs are crucial engines of the local economy's source of income and employment. And in few cases, MSEs act as an informal safety net mechanism. Next, I'm going to explain on the framework, the mechanism on how targeted social assistance program might affect local economies. So basically, there are two main mechanisms. First is from the resource transfers that the beneficiaries receive from the program. The second is through the conditionality. This mechanism will then affect other factors that eventually will affect the local economies. Here, from a resource transfer, it will relax the budget constraint that face household. It also improve asset security and resource allocation. And this will then increase the consumption or demand for goods and services, improve the human capital labor supply, also increase asset accumulation, and might also improve the credit access for micro and small enterprises. Similar mechanism might also work from the conditionality of the program, where it improves the human capital and living condition of the beneficiaries. In this study, we use several data. First is the list of PKH sub-district recipients from 2007 to 2012 from the Ministry of National Development Planning or Bappenas. We also use survey of micro and small enterprises from the BPS. We combine this data with village census data or PODES for several years, and also information on geophysical at village level from various sources. This map shows the location of sub-district where the PKH being implemented in 2012. Since in 2013, the program underwent a large expansion to almost every province. So we focus the study up until 2012. Here's the treatment economic attributes based on group for sub-district with PKH and sub-district without a PKH. As you can see that the p-value shows there are significant differences between the two groups for lights on main road, hospital availability, and also posyandu availability. However, in general, the sub-district shows similar characteristics. We use these variables as controls in our specification. Okay, I'm going to explain on the identification strategy. In this study, we exploit a variation occurring from the different timing of PKH implementation across sub-districts. The pressure to cover all provinces and at the same time to stay within the budget during the expansion of the program. Variation in the sequence of receiving the subsequent PKH due to a natural exit. For example, households have exceeded the poverty line or no longer have children of school age. Also for the reason of a central government budget constraint and the conditionality compliance. but it is less likely as the enforcement is weak. Similar approach has been used in several other studies. This is the empirical model of our studies. We use pseudo panel data with index I for enterprise, V for village, S sub-district, and T year. Our left-hand side variable is the labor productivity indicators. For example, output per worker, value added per worker, and a number of workers. On right-hand side, we have this T, big T, in specification 1 as a dummy variable equals 1 if the resident of sub-district receive PKH. While in model 2, we have small t from T1 until T5, which indicate a certain years where when the sub-district receive PKH as the first, the second, third, fourth, or fifth time. We also control for owner characteristic as well as enterprise characteristic. We also have village characteristic as the control, and we have this sub-district fixed effect and year fixed effect. The standard error are clustered by province. Because the implementation of PKH might suggest a correlation within a province for the program. Okay, this is the result of our paper. Here I only show you for output per worker, while for another indicators, they show non-significant results. Here, as you might see that the PKH exert positive effect on output per worker in the medium term. So there is no effect. There is no immediate impact of PKH in the short run. However, in the medium term, we saw positive and significant effect of PKH on output per worker. For the robustness test, we evaluate whether any confounding factors might affect our results. Here, we include other programs, other social assistance program that happen to be implemented at the same time with the PKH. Here, we also include the fixed asset per worker at the enterprise level, as it might affect our result. Here, we found that there is no indication of any of these confounding factors. We also check whether there is a spatial spillovers or the self-selection by doing regression for eligible sub-district only. We also check whether there is a reverse causality where we regress the implementation of PKH in future. Here, in general, we see that the results are robust to different specification. So we argue that the results are robust. Next, we are interested to know the mechanism under the result. As MSEs are tend to be credit constrained, and this limitation might affect their performance. Here, we see whether credit constraint might be the mechanism for this the result we find. Here, we check for those MSEs who receive credit from bank and credit from different sources, credit from bank, cooperative or non-bank, and we also check for those who receive credit from bank. Here we find that the implementation of PKH in the medium term improve the access of credit for the small enterprises. However, we see that the credit, those who receive credit from bank, the result is not significant for those receive credit from bank. This might explain why in the short term we didn't see any effect of PKH. However, in the medium term, we have a positive effect of PKH on the performance of micro and small enterprises. Okay, to conclude, the paper shows that the PKH benefited MSEs in treatment sub-districts by increasing their output per worker in the medium term by about 23%. The overall effect is mainly driven by the increased productivity in urban areas, in villages near to cities, and in non-coastal areas. The implementation of the PKH benefits both male and female-owned enterprises. We also shows that the credit constraint is a channel through which the program affect local economies. There are some policies implications from these studies. First is regarding the sustainability of the programs. So it is when the programs being run for 5 to 6 years, then the effect might trickle down to the local economies. And however, based on our heterogeneity effect analysis, we see that there is a need to recognize the limitation of the side effect of such programs, as the effect mainly driven in areas with better infrastructure. And regarding credit access, policymakers could ease access to credit for MSEs so that they can improve their productivity. That's all from me. Thank you. I'm looking forward to hearing comment and suggestion from all of you.
Thank you, Bu Ana. Interesting presentation, and I'm sure everyone by now understand that you can post question or comments using one of two ways. Either click the raise hand function, so you can ask it directly later, or you can write it in the chat box. Yeah, right now I don't see any raised hand or chat box, so let me take this. Oh, ada dari Pak Cyril. Okay, Pak Cyril. If you would like to post your question right now, go ahead. And I see Pak Ridwan is also raising hand after Pak Cyril, ya. Silakan.
Okay, thank you, ma'am, for the wonderful presentation. I would like to ask about how can the government divert the PKH beneficiaries from another program such as Village Fund Cash Transfer and COVID-19 Cash Transfer, and how can PKH programs adapt with COVID-19 pandemic crisis? Thank you.
Okay, before you answer that, may we take the question from Pak Ridwan?
Yeah, thank you, thank you, Ibu Ana, for your nice presentation. Given that the impact of increased labor productivity seems to be observed more in the medium long run, do you have any indication, do you see any influence of education levels, local education levels, whether indirectly or directly, any kind of observation or hypothesis you might have developed in the meantime on that potential co-effect? Yeah.
Thank you. Silakan, Ibu Ana.
Thank you for your question. First, sorry, I'm a bit miss on the first question. It is whether other programs might also influence the effect of the findings?
Yes.
Yeah, I
and,
think.
Okay.
Yeah, as here we focus on PKH. However, as in the robustness check, we are afraid whether there are any confounding factors, for example, from other social assistance programs. For example, here we check whether the Ask Skin or other programs implemented in the area might influence our results. From the robustness check, we see that the positive and significant effect of the PKH is still there, even after we included this that other programs. So we quite optimistic that this is the result should be okay. Then on the how PKH might adapt to this COVID-19 situation, I think it's the way the government integrated the social assistance program being implemented. So if during during the pandemic, the government provide special programs for small enterprises. However, since I think the problem we have, one of it is challenges is that how to target to these small enterprises. I think the last time the government provide for the MSEs, they don't really have this database on which SMEs to target. I think if we have data on which household with small enterprise, the household that involved in this kind of small enterprises, then the government can basically integrate the program, and at the same time, I think then the effect might improve both for the enterprise performance as well as the household welfare. And for the second question is whether local education level might also have impact on this setting. Here, because our we don't really have information on the potential of the in terms of education for the at the sub-district level. However, we for the enterprise, we have this owner education. We have the characteristic of owner of the entrepreneur on education as well as experience, if I'm not mistaken. And we also, for the way we might capture the education, the potential of the sub-district by having this fixed effect of the at the sub-district level. Thanks.
Because we are nearing the end of this session, let me close the session for the first paper. But if anyone still has questions or comments, please write them in the chat box, and the authors will be able to answer in the chat box. I actually have a question on why the effect is not observed is only observed in non-coastal areas, but I'll write that in the chat box. So let's move on to the next paper so that we can complete all the presentations. The second paper is entitled Subnational Government Spending Patterns, the case of exogenous resource windfalls under partial fiscal decentralization. This is by Dr. Ridwan Rusli from the Technische Hochschule Köln. So silakan, Pak Ridwan, as usual, it's maximum 20 minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can everyone see this?
Yeah, we can see it. Yep.
And if I move them into the next page, everybody, the slides do follow on your screen.
One.
Okay,
yes.
Great. Thank you very much for the chance to speak here. I'm very happy to get this chance. And of course, on behalf of my co-author, Wessel Vermeulen, who is now with OECD and Newcastle University. We've been working on this subject matter, on this topic for quite a number of years. There are still a few puzzling results. And I think one of our difficulties over the years has been, I've been away from Indonesia for 40 years, to be honest. We don't have enough context in Indonesia, or we hope to, that's why, we're speaking here, hoping to meet more like-minded, interested colleagues, researchers who might help us shed light and investigate and find and develop answers for some of these interesting or puzzling results. Okay, so I'm just going to go to background and then a bit of a summary, and then the empirics, and of course the open questions, which I'd like to use to stimulate response. It's about decentralization, governance, and public spending. Okay, on a district level, I'm not going to go through any detail here. There's the general, of course, literature on Indonesia. Many of you are aware of it. There are plenty of people who have written about it and definitely know more than us or than me. Also on district fragmentation, which for some of the district government behaviors and characteristics could be quite relevant as well. And of course, about governance, public services, corruption, and so on. I mean, there's plenty of literature. Many of you are aware of it. Specifically on district government spending, there's quite a bit of work done by Pak Shahrir and colleagues, Cruz on healthcare spending, on elections accountability, of course, lots of other papers by Olken and so on and so forth. And more recently, Grossman, Lewis, Pierce Scala on fragmentation, district proliferation, public service delivery, election cycles, and so on. And then when it comes to the resource sector, there's the general, of course, literature on resource curves, resource governance. There have been, over the last 5 years or so, more and more, 5 to 7 years, more and more subnational studies. And one of them is actually, and then of course on the Indonesian resource and resource sector, forestry, Barr et al., Burgess on the, illegal deforestation, that's the paper, the nice paper with Olken as well, and so on illegal deforestation during election times or pre-election times. And then a number of papers, of course, on the fiscal equations, right? The district budgets, and on resource blessings, one of which was work I've done in 2014 with a colleague at the time at Oxford, where we found fiscal windfalls from oil improves GRDP district level. So our focus now is Bruckner calls decentralization schemes like in Indonesia kind of a partial fiscal decentralization. where revenues are still quite controlled by the center. For example, the DAU, right? The Dana Alokasi Umum is, of course, a very big chunk of the revenue of the districts. But at the same time, there is very high local government spending autonomy since the decentralization laws. So in that sense, it's called partial fiscal decentralization by Brückner. And what we're trying to investigate is that when there is natural resource extraction, and we happen to have specific with geographic information system data on oil and gas production that we can relate to district levels, right? And we then develop an instrument to create a really exogenous fiscal windfall variable that we then use to study how it impacts the district government spending behavior, revenue and spending behavior, okay? And so decentralization, district autonomy in Indonesia since 1999, high reliance on DAU on the revenue side, but of course, the district share of fiscal windfalls from resource extraction has increased significantly since 1999. That's the interesting part here. And therefore, high local government spending discretion. So what we study is the impact of exogenous resource windfalls on district government budget, local business taxes, fiscal balancing funds, and especially on the public capital expenditure, infrastructure versus what are called indirect, personnel, admin, social aid spending. And what we also study is how all this is affected by when interacted with local economic governance, which was based on the Economic Governance Index, EGI, that were surveyed by KPPOD and the Asia Foundation between 2007 and 2010. Okay. So summary, generally desirable spending patterns, but some inefficiencies. And the biggest puzzling question that really violates the fiscal formula is the continued increase in DAU. And that's where we definitely welcome inputs, thoughts, speculations, maybe even from the audience and from anyone. Fiscal windfalls dominate local economic spillovers and promote growth. This is what Kast and I discovered or observed a number of years ago. Fiscal windfalls increase, which is good, debt repayment and savings. Public capital expenditures, goods and services, also desirable. Social and financial aids, payments, transfers. However, inefficiency remains because we will see that whenever interacted with the Economic Governance Index, we see that the coefficients of spending all decrease, which means the more prudent, better governed district governments actually handle the spending with more care, which means there is inefficiency when it comes to the less well-governed districts. And again, we'll get back to this, the EOE, the DAU puzzle. Okay, so there's a clear correlation. Sorry for the unclear legends. This is production of oil and gas, and this is oil and gas revenue windfalls in the budgets that go into the as a part of the revenue, right? And clearly, of course, they increase. And the reason it doesn't increase from zero is that districts actually, by virtue of the 1999 decentralization laws, each district actually, even if there is no production, actually gets fiscal windfalls sharing from other districts that produced in the same province. Okay, so fiscal sharing, if there's a home district, 6% of oil revenues go back from, so the center collects everything and then transfer back to the districts. 6% of oil royalties, 12% of gas royalties come back to the home district. the province gets 3, respectively 6, and other districts in the same province get 6, respectively 12% of all natural gas royalty. So even if you didn't have oil and gas extraction in your district, you will still get a windfall. So fiscal windfalls, we divide between 0 to 3 miles offshore and 3 to 12 miles offshore, in which case there is a home district at the coastal that is the main district benefiting. That's why we call it, they're called home district if it's within 0 to 3 miles, and home province if it's within 3 to 12 miles. We focus on offshore oil and gas because that's how, and we argue in the paper in greater detail, we can ensure that there is minimum endogeneity in terms of what the district government does as compared to how much production and therefore resource windfalls will come in, okay? And so first, so there are 2 components of this offshore. For 0 to 3 miles, we use basically for each district, it will enjoy the sum of the royalty shares it gets from other neighboring districts in the same province. And then we calculate per capita. At the same time, for 3 to 12 miles offshore, in which case there's a home province that is supposed to mainly enjoy the windfalls, the districts in that province also get a share. And that is what this says here, total windfalls for this province divided by the number of districts in that same province. And therefore, each district enjoys windfalls from its own production, which we, however, do not account for because we want to ensure exogeneity. What we do account for is the fiscal windfall that is totally beyond the control of the district government. So it's a really purely exogenous windfall by virtue of a district government getting the windfall from neighboring district production and from the provincial entitlement that it gets from very far away 3 to 12 miles offshore extraction locations. Okay. And then basically we use the production of oil in these faraway province, home province kind of entitlement, oil and gas extraction, and from the neighboring districts with production within all offshore, within the same province. And we use their production as a instrument for the transfers, the actual fiscal windfalls. Okay, so this is just, so we use the 2005-2009 panel data. We use Wood Mackenzie oil and gas data, which we can collect by district. The standard BPS population and budget statistics on district level, and the economic governance index data from which have been published extensively by Asia Foundation, Neil McCulloch, Prambudi from KPPOD, and of course have been subject of various publications as well. And so this is just to visualize it a little bit. We have only onshore, offshore, only onshore, in which case we don't take them into account. Onshore and offshore production, although still we only take into account the offshore, the windfalls from offshore. And then of course there are many districts without oil. Okay, this is just a kind of an overview. So now we get to the results and the observations. First of all, the first stage, we can see that the instruments are valid. They're all statistically significant. Neighbors offshore production, provincial offshore production, although for the provincial, it's only the provincial cluster standard error adjustments. We also use Conley and Newey-White standard error adjustments. Okay, and the observations One, on revenues, we see that when there is exogenous fiscal windfall, so you only need to focus on the IV, not on the OLS results. And you can see here local original revenues. These are local taxes, business incomes, and retributions. They decrease, and especially financing inflows decrease. So there is less need for external financing, debt, and so on and so forth. The interesting part, the puzzling part, is that the balanced budget total increases significantly, right? Now, on the one hand, there's the resource revenue itself, but in the detail, we can see that DAU increases significantly. For every dollar of revenue windfall, DAU actually increases by 0.4, which is, of course, counter to the fiscal formula or to the intention of DAU. Okay? Now, provincial tax allocation to the districts decreases, which is not unexpected. But what is really good is, of course, that the financing inflows decrease and the need for local retributions in particular, decrease. Now, when we talk about the social service expenditures, we can see that there's a positive impact on, this is public service, positive impact on capital expenditures, infrastructure spending, public service goods, public goods and services, again, related to infrastructure spending in general, and some increase in public service personnel, which are usually related to these public infrastructure projects. So they're all significantly positive. When we get to the social and civil expenditures, you can see, and this is, I would say, quite a positive observation. There is non-statistical increase in administrative and bureaucratic costs, but increases in social aid payments. And this is the surely very positive increase in savings and debt repayments. Okay, so that the balance sheet of the districts becomes stronger, so to speak. Okay. Now, what we've also done is we interact all these with EGI, with the Economic Governance Index. Now, when it comes to the public services, we see that the positive coefficients for public service personnel and public service capital expenditures actually turn negative. That means for the average EGI, the average governance quality, let's say, across the country from the worst to the best, as a matter of fact, the public service CapEx decreases. Now, in terms of public service personnel, we say, okay, the local government becomes more prudent. The average one is more prudent than the worst ones. Now, which is kind of expected, desirable. But on the other hand, the fact that the average EGI district government actually decreases public service CapEx might indicate, and more work needs to be done here, that the public service expenditures in terms of CapEx might still harbor some inefficiency. And indeed, Lewis, in some of his papers, also wrote about this, that public service payment or expenditures can be used for good or not so good purposes, right? And we can see all these when the interaction term is all negative, which means district governments that are better governed generally are more prudent, which is what we would expect. When it comes to the civil service payments, also again, negative here, which means they become more prudent. Luckily, social aid is still positive for the average governed district. But here, the fact that these are very positive, both in terms of interaction terms and the average EGI kind of like effect on financing expenditures, which are debt repayment and savings into the contingency funds, is also something that we should all welcome, because that shows that the better governed districts also manage their finances more prudently. They put more money into the contingency funds, and they repay debt that is less necessary. And finally, when it comes to revenues, we can see that in terms of financing inflows, they also decrease with better governance, and local taxes also decrease with the need to add or increase local taxes also decreases with better governance. So in that sense, I'm just summarizing now: fiscal windfalls from resource extraction, decreased retributions, increased public infrastructure spending, reduced proportion of personal admin costs. However, the AU still increases, our biggest puzzle. Analysis of EGI improves prudence across the board. Again, still increases DAU. I was actually really hoping when we ran the EGI that the DAU will be negative, right? But unfortunately, it's still positive, right? And so how come the DAU allocation still violates the fiscal rules? It should supposed to be decreasing for richer districts. That was the purpose, right? And of course, we welcome input and ideas how to improve on our study in terms of better identify, capture or potential inefficiencies in the balancing funds and public infrastructure spending. And the EGI itself is rather, let's say, outdated by now. 2000. Of course, for our study, it was the right, time frame. But definitely, EGI is something that whoever it is, various institutions in Indonesia should try to expand on and update, because it's quite an important yardstick competition type benchmark that is quite valuable for a lot of policy questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Ridwan. So I invite questions and comments through either raising your hand, or you can write it in the chat box. I see Pak Budi Reso Sudarmo raising hand. Silakan, go ahead, Pak Budi.
Yes, thank you very much, Pak Ridwan, for the presentation. It is a very interesting research, and it is seems to me it's well written and well presented. So my question are actually several. The first one is that whether district production, neighboring district production is really an exogenous. I guess you need to distinguish between offshore or not offshore. The one that is inshore is probably the other district could easily influence. Now, the other thing is that even it is offshore, given head of district are communicate a lot within them, I'm not that sure that their decision is really independent. So that is the issue of exogeneity. And the second one is on the output. If you look at the budget as so maybe this is because I misunderstand the variable. If it is an increase as a level, that is kind of a formula, isn't it? Because you got your neighbor got production and then you got revenue, and it is just an increase. But I think the one that has been discussed is that whether those who get a windfall actually having an opportunity to correct the proportion of their budget. For example, the proportion of their budget for education, the proportion of their budget for, so that so it's not looking at the level, because the level is kind of obvious, but whether the windfall is provide them kind of budget freedom to rearrange their budget. And the other important thing is that how that related to the average situation in Indonesia. Now, that is important because there are regulation coming in for several years that tag into a certain sector. And so that need to be probably carefully look. That's my comment, and thank you for the presentation.
Yeah.
Since it's quite a lot, silakan. Go ahead, Pak, to address these comments first.
Thank you, Pak Budi. Thanks as usual. Very insightful questions. So in terms of exogeneity, right? A couple of things. One is definitely offshore, as we all recognize, has is more likely to be exogenous, especially if it's far away, than onshore. That's one. That's why we chose offshore. Secondly, we deliberately did not include the home district itself or the home province itself, government, but the neighboring districts in the province. And secondly, the districts within obviously the producing province for the 3 to 12 miles. Now, thirdly, my experience has been, because I was actually working in the oil and gas industry for a number of years myself, is that many of the offshore projects or compared to some other countries like Brazil, well, in Indonesia, the private sector companies have been quite well represented and involved, let's say beyond Pertamina, right, as a national oil company. And so many of these make their decisions independently. Many of them are subsidiaries of international oil companies. And when it comes to decisions for this type of, whether it's exploration, extraction, and so on and so forth, they are, I would say, so it's more a fragmented decision-making process, looking at it from an aggregate. And ultimately, of course, they liaise with the district government, but much less so if it's an offshore project, given the fact that all the licenses and in Indonesia in the oil and gas sector are still controlled by BP Migas, i.e. by Jakarta, right? And this is very different when we talk about mining or forestry naturally, where the district governments are much more in control. So in that sense, the combination of this strategy we hope is, let's say, sufficient to ensure the highest degree of exogeneity possible. Naturally, I mean, like perfect exogeneity, I don't think we will argue or we hope to get there, but it's as exogenous as we can find it so far, given the variables and the kind of like the physical realities, let's say, and the decision-making realities out there. I hope that does address your question, at least partially. When it comes to the budget freedom, that is indeed one thing that we still need to more carefully look at, because it's easy to say, and we understand it's definitely simplistic to say, okay, yes, they get the DAU, the districts get the resource windfalls, and they have full freedom to to spend it any which way they wish. But definitely we need to be more careful and segment that statement or assumption greater detail. But we will try and look into it more specifically, component by component. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps one other quick question, if there is a question, because we are at the end of time for this paper. If not, let's move on to the third paper. Hopefully, if you have comments or questions, you can write it in the chat box for the paper for Pak Ridwan and co-author. But otherwise, let's move on to the next paper. Thank you, Pak Ridwan. The third paper is by the team at Universitas Padjadjaran. I think will be presented by Kevin Dennis Tito Siregar and Wicsadana, that entitled Diagnosing Dutch Disease Effect Towards Rural Poverty, Empirical Evidence from Indonesia. So go ahead, please. Is it Wicsadana who is going to be presenting?
It is me and Cyril.
Oh, okay, sorry. Go ahead, and maximum 20 minutes as usual.
Okay, we are already asked for the crew to present the presentation. Okay, good afternoon, Honorable Chair, Professor, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the wonderful opportunity that have been given to us. I am Cyril Anfasa Firmansyah, along with Wicsadana, would like to present our paper with the title of Diagnosing Dutch Disease Effect Towards Rural Poverty, an Empirical Evidence from Indonesia. Next. So there's the content then that we would gonna share. The first part is background, the second is research gap, the third is data and methodology, the most important part is findings, and then last but not least is conclusions. So there's the author of this research. I am Cyril Anfasa Firmansyah, and
I am Wicsadana, and we have our colleagues, Mr. Kevin Dennis Tito Siregar and Mr. Esro Daretno Sihaloho.
Okay, so we move on to the background. Next. So natural resource status quo of Indonesia. On the left-hand side, there is a graphic showing the Indonesia natural resource sector rents percentage of GDP in 2019 from World Bank data. In the Asia Pacific region, Indonesia has become the world's second coal production with 15.05 exajoules after China that could produce almost 72 exajoules. Indonesia has also a leading exporter of gold, bauxite, lead, zinc, and copper. As we know also that Freeport Grasberg mine site is the largest world producer for gold and then the third largest for copper. On the right-hand side, there is Indonesia natural resource sector development percentage of GDP from 2015 to 2019 from World Bank data. Indonesia has the world's third largest forest cover, mostly in Sumatra, Kalimantan, Papua. Agricultural land cover for about 29% of land areas and consists of arable land, permanent crops, and permanent pasture and meadows. So I would gonna explain about Dutch disease and rural poverty. On the left-hand side, there is a curve showing the theoretical framework of Dutch disease. I'm gonna explain a little bit. On the vertical axis, there is a tradable goods. On the horizontal axis, there is a non-tradable goods. And initial equilibrium is at point A that there is a social transformation curve that in tangency with indifference curve. As the income inflows shown at point F, there is an increase. The curve PP shift to curve PPF and shown at the point AXN. There's an excess of demand for non-tradable goods, as the price of non-tradable good is unchanged and the supply also is unchanged. So it is the relative price of non-tradable to tradable goods must go up to clear the market. So when the price go up, there is an appreciation of real exchange rate, since the tradable goods is determined in the world market. So this effect is called the spending effect. After that, as the relative price of non-tradable to the tradable good rise, there is a resource movement from the tradable sector to non-tradable sector, which explain the resource movement effect or Dutch disease. After that, in the long term, there is as the income inflows, the countries start to utilize the income inflows from foreign to utilize the domestic sector capital accumulation, and then shifting from curve PPF to P accent. And the initial equilibrium is at the point C, and it might be explained the mitigation of Dutch disease effect, the economic impact of Dutch disease effect. On the right hand side, there is a percentage of rural poverty from 2015 and 2020 percentage. There's a continuous trend of decrease, but started to increase again of rural poverty at the year of 2020. Through the formalization and diversification, the job have contributed to both eliminating poverty and reducing inequality. However, the majority of the poor lack of opportunity to work in the formal sector due to so many factors, and thereby protect their income from the crisis. It is explained why poverty is so persistent in rural areas. Next. So we move on to the research gap. So the motivation of this paper is the paradox of abundance, often known as the resource curse. And in this research, there is a natural resource curse, has been a topic of discussion for more than 30 years, with a wide range of theoretical perspective and scientific perspective. The goal of this research is to determine the impact of Dutch disease in Indonesia. Natural resources frequently play a major part in the theoretical explanation of the Dutch disease and are significantly related to the economy, because it can both stimulate the economic growth or as a cause of bad economic performance. The main research question is, how does the natural resource industry sector affect the level of rural poverty in Indonesia?
Okay, next. Okay, now we are going to discuss about the data and methodology used in this study. Okay, for the data, we utilize mainly province level data across all Indonesia. This includes 32 provinces in Indonesia with a time frame or time span around 10 years. That is from 2010 until 2019. There are two main models used in this model. First, we use the robust fixed effect panel data regression for our main model and Granger causality model for our secondary model. The secondary model, because I'm going to discuss first about the secondary model. The secondary model itself uses three main variables, namely natural resource rent, which is a national level data obtained from the World Bank, manufacturing and services ratio, and sector-specific regional gross domestic product, which is obtained from BPS or the National Statistic Bureau. Since natural resource rent, the one from the World Bank, is an national level data, we first transform it into province level data to able to capture the Dutch disease phenomenon on a province level. This is achieved by calculating the proportion of province level RGDP to national GDP, mainly in mining and forestry. After that, after finding the proportion, we multiply it by the natural resource rent to obtain the province level natural resource rent. Continuing, we then use the Granger causality to evaluate and estimate the direction of the causality. There are two main periods that are analyzed. The first one is from 2010 until 2014, and the second period is 2015 until 2019. The output of the secondary model is a dummy variable that indicates the existence of Dutch disease in sorry. Okay. The output of the secondary model is a dummy variable that indicates the existence of the Dutch disease in 2 different periods for each region in Indonesia. We identify a province in a certain period in Indonesia experience a Dutch disease when regional natural resource trend negatively and significantly greater causes manufacturing and services ratio. Then the secondary model is used in our main model. For our main model, we use the robust fixed effect panel data regression. This model uses as our objective for this paper, rural poverty rate at its dependent variable, and that's disease for its independent variable. We also utilize other independent variables such as average years of schooling, life expectancy, government expenditure, and rural credit. We utilize robust fixed effect panel data regression due to the Hausmann test result and to compensate for the presence of autocorrelation and heteroscedasticity present in this model. Next. So this is the regression result for our main model. As you can see, in an overall matter, every independent variable has a negative impact on rural poverty. However, it came with various significancy. Next. Next. The study found that in terms of Dutch disease, the model showed that in Indonesia, the existence of Dutch disease from the period from 2010 until 2013 reduces rural poverty rate. However, the correlation was not significant. So this first finding is quite puzzling. The second one, in terms of an average years of schooling, regarding using raw interpretation, the value of 0.17 means that an increase of 1 unit or 1 year of an average year of schooling. On average, we reduce rural poverty rate by 0.17%. The third finding, in terms of life expectancy, the value of negative 0.35 implies that an increase of 1 unit or 1 year of life expectancy on average will reduce rural poverty by 0.35%. Our fourth finding, in terms of government expenditure, the value of 0.53 means that an increase in government expenditure of 1% will reduce rural poverty rate by 0.005%, and this is significant at a 5% significant level. And finally, in terms of rural credit, the value of negative 1.2 means that an increase, 1% increase in rural credit on average will reduce poverty by 0.01%. Next. We concluded that whether that the seals will induce a positive or negative impact for a country, it is important to reduce the chance of negative impact while the government optimizes the potential of positive impact. The need to diversify the economy could be achieved by subsidizing lagging sector of the economy and establishing import tariff to protect domestic product. Through formalization and diversification, the job have contributed to both eliminating poverty and reducing inequality. However, the majority of the poor lack opportunities to work in the formal sector and thereby protect their income from shock, which explain why poverty is so persistent in rural areas in Indonesia. Next. Thank you. Thank you for your attention. This is still a working paper, so we are still currently still developing and trying to accurately capture the effect of Dutch disease in rural poverty in Indonesia. So we would be very happy if there is any feedback, criticism, or opinion regarding this study or the model. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great presentation. And thank you for the speedy. You're using less time than allocated, much less time than allocated. feel free to raise your hand or write in the chat box. Also, I noticed if Pak Ridwan has not noticed, there is a question for Pak Ridwan from Ibu Ana about the sign of the coefficient for public services. Just want to flag that out. While waiting for the comments from the audience, maybe I will just raise a couple of points that I thought was interesting. Is that have you thought that there is some lag in the impact of revenues from natural resources to its impact on various things, including poverty? So if this has been thought about. And the second one is about the timing. Usually resource curve studies cover a longer, relatively long period of time. And for your paper, it covers, I think, is it starting 2010? If I'm not mistaken,
Yes.
or yeah. So if you can discuss a little bit about this time period coverage. That's all from me. Given that there are no other comments yet, feel free to respond to this first.
Okay. First of all, thank you for the for the question. Regarding the lag in the model, I think we actually do not take into lag. So I think it would be really interesting and it will be more accurate if we use the lag regarding the Dutch disease in our model to see if the output of the model is relatively different or not. Regarding atau lagi
about the time period covered by the study.
Regarding the time period of the study, actually we choose between 2010 and 2019 because the availability of the data in our main model. For the secondary model, the Granger causality, I think it is wise to use a longer period of data because in our literature review regarding Dutch disease, it usually have a longer time span. However, in our main model, with its many dependent variable have a limited data availability, very limited data availability that only covers from the earliest is only 2008. So then, due to pragmatic what we call it, solution, we use from 2010 until 2019. It's because the availability of time data in our main model.
Okay, thank you. It's very clear for me. Again, I invite comments and questions from everyone. Oh, sorry, I just saw the chat. Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Sure, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Madam. So I'm the fellow author of this paper, and I also want to add the answer for the second question. So actually, besides the availability of the data, it's also talk about the political stances of the situations of natural resources. The time range from 2010 until 2019 is, I think, we think that it's one of the possible time range because it is put or the intentions of from the government of Mr. Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono until Mr. Jokowi. I think that we also want to add the stances of the political issues right there and how the government put the policy to understand how actually this natural resources management happen in Indonesia especially. So I think that's from me. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Sure, but yeah, the constraint of data, maybe you have to have a strategy for that. But in terms of natural resource allocation, for example, especially if you look at the provincial and sub-provincial level, perhaps the watershed moment is the local government decentralization law in the early 2000s. If there are no other comments, or if you are still thinking of still digesting the information, feel free to write your comments or questions later in the chat box, or interact with the researchers through the WUFA app. So for now, I think we can move to the next paper. So the last paper in the session is by a team from Universitas Sulawesi Barat. And I think will be presented by Ibu Kasmiati, entitled Regulatory Suffocating Participation. Very interesting title. The Stagnation of Forestry Agrarian Reform in Balumpewa Village, Sigi Regency, Central Sulawesi Province. So if you are ready, go ahead, please, Ibu, with a maximum of 20 minutes as usual. Thank you. Ibu Kasmiati, you're still muted. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Bu Lydia. I'm Tata or Kasmiati. Thanks to before I start this meeting, I want to say sorry because now I'm online from the location of my field work in the little island, so maybe my bandwidth is a little weak, and then any some sounds from the children. This is the only place I can access the signal. Okay, our research is about regulatory suffocating participation, the stagnation of forestry agrarian reform in Balumpewa Village in Sigi Regency, Sulawesi Tengah. I write this research with some of my colleagues. There are Muhammad Sohibuddin from IPB University, and then Gani Sofseviana and Ahmad Jaitullah from the Sajogyo Institute, and then this research supported by Knowledge Sector Initiative. The background of this research are after long thinking Indonesian agrarian reform policy finally strengthened after the new order through the National Agrarian Reform Program launched by the Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, and then the program now is continued by the Jokowi government, which has been set since the year of 2015 to 2019 through the RPJMN, and then the year 2020 and 2024 RPJM is one of the national priority programs. That in the 2007 legal foothold on the settlement on land tenure in forest area or called PPTKH was published through Presidential Regulation Number 8080 of 2007. This rule is one of the government's instruments to establish the land object of agrarian reform, or called TORA, program in forest area. In the following year, Presidential Regulation Number 86 of 28 on agrarian reform include forest area as one of the objects of agrarian reform was also published. These two legal instruments are expected to solve problems related to land in forest area. But the implementation process of the policy got many criticism, especially from civil society organizations that actively proposing TORA based on participation mapping process. For example, in Sigi Regency, Sulawesi Tengah, there is collaboration work between the local government and then the Sigi Regency Agrarian Reform Task Force, or GTRA, and a civil organization like YMP, JKPP, and KPA, together with residents participatory work with an aim to propose TORA, the central and provincial governments. But the result issued mainly by the PTKH team are still far from local residents' expectations. The proposed TORA of Sigi Regency in forest area in 6,800 hectare, while only 3,000 hectare are agreed by the PTKH team to be removed from the forest area as can be processed to be TORA from the forest area. This is how us that there is a big gap in size are between the proposed TORA by the local community and the final result of verification by the PTKH team. Now, the acceleration of the agrarian reform from Strategi Nasional has been focused on being the fifth priority program, which is to allocate forest resource to be managed by the people. This scheme is now implemented at the Sigi Regency government of Sulawesi Tengah. But ironically, even as a pilot district, the implementation of forestry agrarian reforms encounters many obstacles. For example, one of the villages that proposed TORA for forest area in the Sigi Regency is Balumpewa village. Residents in this village have participated in various endeavors ranging from participatory mapping, allocating budget for agrarian reform, and then the proposal TORA, residents of Balumpewa village is stagnant. On the other hand, participation is considered as one of the conditions that can encourage the success of the program. Hence, the question is why is the participatory agrarian reform in Sigi Regency, especially in Balumpewa village, remains stagnant? Where are the blocks in the process, and that what causes this paper tries to answer this fundamental question. And then the methods, similarly, this is the only qualitative research in this room. So the methods we use is ethnography, and then we also conduct direct observation with in-depth interview and focus group discussion with various stakeholders related to the term of this research. I will start with the social ecological landscape of Balumpewa village. This village is a old village that has been inhabited by the Kaili people, especially sub-ethnic Inde, long before Indonesia became independent. But over the past few decades, the Topo Inde community in the Balumpewa has had to face the real threat of losing access to their ancestral lands due to unilateral claims on behalf of the state. The land they have worked on suddenly entered into state control called a protected forest or conservation forest. And then if a unilateral claim based on the country's positive laws is upheld, then anytime Balumpewa citizens may lose access to their livelihoods or land. This is the landscape of Balumpewa currently. Land status area community just have a 200 hectare land, and then all the green color in this map is a state forest. So the statization process begin from the decree of the Ministry of Agriculture, or in this village, having the decree of the government make the village through the statization process, or negaraisasi in bahasa. From the cultivation to participation for agrarian reform, because their village being a forest, the community trying to access again their land. What they are doing for that is participative mapping, and then processing, determining, and subject or object of agrarian reform proposed by the community. and in the process of participation, local institutions supporting the participation of Balumpewa residents. There are any 3 local institutions that supports community participation. There are the village government or pemerintah desa, and then a religious institution or a crutch, gereja, and then customary institution. These 3 things are important because it can be imagined that if the stakeholder in the 3 institutional system have different orientation, it will certainly break down peasants' perspective and potentially break up the Balumpewa farmer movement. The next, even the community was participating to in the Tora or agrarian reform, but Tora in Balumpewa Village fall short of expectation. The rejection of Tora submitted by the Balumpewa resident is related to the status of the land submitted by the Balumpewa residents. Almost 100% comes from forest area, which is the verification process must pass through various filters following 1. Presidential Regulation number 88 of 2007 concerning settlement of land tenure in forest area, and the second, Regulation of Coordinating Ministry of Economic Affairs number 30 of 2008 concerning guidelines for the inventory and verification team of land tenure in forest area. These 2 regulations is the important obstacle of the proposal submitted by community. So in the principle, the above 2 regulations are still very conventional. Namely, the process of releasing forest are still refers to the old regulation that tend to maintain the status quo of forest areas through the verification process based on the function of forest area. Require the length of time of land management worker, as well as is distinguished the type of use of Tora in the forest area, whether for plantation, public facility, social or residential facility. So the above regulation have not supported the acceleration of land tenure settlement in forest area or PPTKH because specific programs such as agrarian reform in forest area. We can see in the Tora proposal. The most likely proposal came from conservation forest as much as 300 hectares. Then from protected forest covering area is 100 more hectares, and the rest came from APL or area penggunaan lain, covering an area of just 2 hectares. The filtration process refers to the 2 regulations used when verifying the Tora proposal of the residents of Balumpewa village. So the Tora in this village differs greatly between the community's proposal and the verification result issued by the government. This is a very wide difference is mainly in implication of the status of conservation forest. Tora in conservation forest cannot be processed further they automatically do the resettlement as the one only solution provided. And then the one and only solution provided is a resettlement. So if the forest is conservation, government just having one solution, that is a resettlement. Because of that, get in chaos, agrarian reform participatory action under agrarian reform regulation. The regulation that serve as the basis for implementing the forestry agrarian reform have standard and rigid requirements. So it's very inflexible in responding to social ecological situation at the site level. As a result, even the most participatory proposal cannot be accommodated because the requirement for releasing forest area in the current regulation work as a filterization tool for Tora proposal for forest area. Besides, and then the conclusion of this research is The case of Balumpewa show us that the active participation of citizens in promoting forestry agrarian reform only has the power to the extent proposing forest area as TORA for verification. But after the assignment, the proposal stack is complete. Participation no longer has any meaning for policy making. Sorry. Community participation had not been considered and neither able to influence that the import team's decision making to change or release the status of the forest area to suit the residents' proposal, because the PTKH team only adheres to main rules for implementing forestry, namely that I was mentioned, presidential regulation, and regulation of the coordinating Minister of Economic Affairs. In which these two regulations take the participatory roles of the residents themselves hostage, because in the regulation there is no participatory space that gives residents in the right or opportunity to object the decision of the PTKH team. The result of the verification team issued by the PTKH team to become an absolute decision. The committee does not have the opportunity to sue or reject the result of the verification, so that various participatory works and efforts deadlock because of rigid regulation and generalize the whole situation at the site level. Various participatory efforts citizens to propose forest area as object agrarian reform have stalled. Too many conditions be met while the offer of solution from the state is restricted. And then the current regulation have to the diversity of social ecological situation in the village that apply for agrarian reform. A new and a comprehensive mechanism for resolving land tenure patterns in forest area is needed, as it is supposed to be more flexible and diverse. I think that's all. Thank you, Ibu Lydia.
Thank you, Ibu Kasmiati. Great to hear about research from Central Sulawesi and to hear from the children in Central Sulawesi. It's good to hear happy children. No, don't apologize. It's normal, yeah. Kids play.
I'm doing a field research. This is the only
yeah,
place
it's okay.
I can access.
It's okay. Great to hear such joyful voice in this time of pandemic. Again, I invite everyone to comment using the chat box or to raise your hand. As usual, I have some comments if while we wait for other comments. So first of all, I think it's great work for agrarian reform, and although I have not kept up in the current literature, I don't know if you have looked into other cases in Indonesia. It's uphill battle, but I know that there are victories, meaning that some communities have actually been able to get some conservation land into their own management. The one that I know is in Banten. So Masyarakat Adat Banten taking over some of the land which previously I think part of the National Park Gunung Halimun. So perhaps that's a case study that can be looked into. I wonder if you have looked into these small success stories. Secondly, of course, maybe there is no compromise from the part of the government or institution managing conservation forests, for example. But I see that in the description of the land that you gave, there are also non-conservation area. Could the community, for example, also what we call that give and take? Okay, so maybe right now the one with less, if there is strong resistance for the reallocation of conservation forests, what about the other forest type? And is the community willing to compromise and focus on the other land types first, and not focused on the conservation forest, for example. So these are two of my comments for now. Maybe respond to that first while we wait for others to provide comments or questions.
Thank you, Bu Lydia. Yes, and then now the community trying the new strategy is trying to access their land by the hutan adat or customary forest. Make shifting from the conservation forest to be a customary forest. But I think the journey is still long. Is a difficulty when you try to access a forest, whatever the scam is agrarian reform, customary forest or hutan adat is still difficult. But the difficulties one is access land is it try to be agrarian reform because the level of own is different. If you with community trying to be make a hutan adat or customary forest is just it's not to be owned but just borrow the land from the government. But agrarian reform concept is the land is owned by the individual or community. Thank you, Bu Lydia.
Okay, yeah. Sometimes it is good to see, to also be a bit realistic, for example, because even if it's hutan adat, if the management is if the management can be done by the community, it might be a compromise for the time being. So it's something that perhaps could be looked into. If there are comments or questions, please put them in the chat box or raise your hand. One other thing that I wanted to mention about, this reform is sometimes tightly linked to the political power or political level of the community. Can you give a little bit of description about the community? Are they marginalized, for example, in terms of their political or social role or position in the Sigi Regency? Is this something that you think might affect the unsuccessful challenge or successful request by the community?
I think the identity is not an obstacle, but it's the strongest, the strong of the community, because they have a strong identity as a community as Inde or is a sub-ethnic of Topo Inde is sub-ethnic of Inde in province Sulawesi in Sulawesi Tengah. But the problem is the regulatory, because till now the government is like open the door, but still you cannot still truck in. The situation like that. Agrarian reform is a national project of our government. But when the community have done anything to participate in this project, and then government to close the door by the rule. In the Sigi, community really strong and participated to try access their land, but the problem is regulation. I think that's all. Yeah,
it's interesting to see, because in some areas there are also some pushback for agrarian reform, because the people in power, for example, in the government or in the parliament, are of different group, for example, political group, social economic group, or ethnic group. So it's good that to hear that, although it's bad to hear that government regulation is obstructing this, but on the other hand, it could be more complicated if there are, for example, ethnic or social economic resistance from other groups in the area. So maybe this is something, if you are looking into expanding the paper for publication, or maybe for publication mainly, this kind of stories about the background of the area, the community, and the interaction, social political interaction at the local level, is probably good, so that we can eliminate the point of contention, the point of the constraints, and focus to the fact that perhaps a regulatory process or the regulation itself will need to be looked into. So I think that is from me, unless anyone else has comment or a question. I see here there is someone from, okay, sorry, from other organizations. If you would like to ask a question or give comment, otherwise I will close the session. All right, so maybe we can close the session early, and don't forget there is a plenary session this afternoon with several speakers, including from the Smerut Institute and from the Australian National University. Thank you to all presenters, to all the papers. Hopefully this session has been informative for you. Personally, I learned a lot from everyone. Good luck with revising the paper, continuing your research, and I look forward to reading publications from you in the future. So thanks again. Let me close the session with a big appreciation and clap for everyone. Thank you.